Welcome to hell.
Why is it so hot down here?
Oh, shit. Sorry. Let me, turn that down there. Sorry, I didn't see your dangly bit there.
Oh, shit, it's out? Oh, you mean my Mjolnir. Yeah. I wasn't expecting all the, fire and whatnot.
Yeah, I know. It's all these damn Christians. If we don't turn on the fireworks, they get, carroty.
Oh, shit, I'm dead. That makes sense. At least I died doing what I love.
Yeah. Anyways, basically their first 3 days are weeping and gnashing of teeth, the fire and the brimstone, and a good pitchfork up the butt. It eases them into it. Don't smell the pitchfork. Just head over the bridge. Hell's Hall's the big-ass building at the end of the road.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, sorry about the light show. It's just that Christians won't have it any other way. Now hurry up. It's Taco Tears Day.
You know, hell's a pretty chill place.
Hell, goddess of the underworld, keeper of the departed, queen of the great beyond. I've got about 13 pages of notes, so hopefully this won't be too long. So first it's hell. It's not Hela. Hela, like Frigga, like Valhalla, these were romanticized and kind of Romanized words by translators. This is not the actual Old Norse. It's hell. Although Jakob Grimm, or Jacob Grimm if you're not a pretentious, of the Grimm's brothers, who compiled a lot of folk tales and Germanic mythology in general, is actually a fairly decent source for lore, by the way. Surmised that the German equivalent might be Halia, but it comes from the Proto-Indo-European reconstructed Kel, meaning hidden. This is, as we'll see later, related to Kolyo, who's a Proto-Indo-European goddess of death. There's some other associations there that we'll go over. An interesting distinction is that Hel is a goddess of the dead, not of dying necessarily. In the Norse, that aspect of the underworld archetype goes to other gods and entities. The archetype is sometimes, but not always, personified as a goddess caretaker. This is the goddess who cares after our departed loved one. This is the personification of where we want to see our loved ones, where we want to see the departed when they leave this mortal coil. And another interesting thing was that I learned more about Odin researching Hell, because Odin is also an underworld god. And we see that with his cognates like Velez, Oran in the Welsh, and we'll go over that a little bit more as we go along. And Odin may take some of those psychopomp roles. A psychopomp is entity or god that guides the departed to the underworld, which with Odin we also see with the Valkyries. They'll get their own video too, don't worry. Seems to be a reluctant position. Every underworld deity isn't there of their own volition, of their own choice. It's something they don't want, which really correlates with how we perceive death. Death isn't something we necessarily want, just an inevitability, right? And the figure of the god of the underworld is either placed there because of an honored death, being the first to die ever in history, or being placed there by someone else. With Hel, we see Odin places her as the goddess of the underworld. And again, that reluctance is based on the perception of how we see dying. A lot of the qualities and the perceptions of the god of the underworld is based on that culture's perception of how they see death, their relation to death. We'll see with the Mesoamericans, they venerated death due to a fear of death, whereas other cultures like the Mesopotamians were extremely reluctant to have effigies of their goddess of death because they were afraid to invoke death. And a lot of cultures are like that. That was another problem with researching underworld gods. There's a lot of limited information, either due to closed practice or because of fear of invocation of death. Some cultures will have multiple death gods. They'll have maybe gods of the different parts of their underworld, or they might have different gods for traveling to the underworld as opposed to actually the one that presides over the underworld. And this is wholly dependent on their perception of how those things would work. The gender of the god also seems to be pretty fluid. I'm using god as a gender neutral. They're not always male, they're not always female. Oftentimes there's two of them, a male and a female. And if there are, then the female tends to take on more caregiver roles. We see with Ereshkigal in the Mesopotamian, she's a little bit less of that. We'll get into that. Hel, the Norse Hel, she definitely has more of that caretaker aspect, which is probably one of the reasons why she's depicted as feminine. And again, I found out that Odin is cognate to most of these underworld deities in some way, shape, or form, because again, he is an underworld deity. It just seems like the Norse themselves venerated him to the point where they put him in an elevated position, which is one of the reasons why they have Loki, who shares some of the qualities with Odin's cognates, as well as Hel herself, who again, obviously descends from Loki. That paternal connection may also be part of trying to almost distance that dark Senex from his position as an underworld god. And again, the characteristics and personality of the deity, which is what makes up a god around the archetype, right? The archetype of the bones, which the personality and the culture is placed upon. That's solely dependent on that perception by that culture. And we'll see that over and over again here. And really most gods are that way. It's also not uncommon for different gods of certain aspects, like many cultures will have different sun gods for different times of day that the sun is at, which is also kind of fascinating. And eventually when I get to a soul video, we'll go over that as well. And one of the reasons that some of these cultures have a fear of the depiction of invoking that deity, because of that animist, polytheist understanding of, if I have a statue of a god, to a certain degree, that God exists within that statue. And with that, polytheism and animism are interconnected. It's really hard to separate the two. I know anthropologists do, but they're basically the same thing. You might have slightly different perceptions, and I'm going to dedicate a video to that too. I've decided that also needs to be defined a little bit more. So by depicting a death deity, they are literally creating a space for that death deity to exist within their domicile or temple or wherever they're at. And really, symbolism is more important than specificity. Certain things that we see with gods and spiritual stuff in general is that they have certain items or certain qualities about them. And those items and qualities have more to do with what they represent, what their force of being entails, rather than the specificity of than like Hel literally having a plate named hunger, right? She may not literally have that thing, but a plate called hunger represents famine. It represents a lack of food, which can lead to death. These are symbolic connections. These are symbolic things in order to help us to understand what that god represents. Specific items like Hel's instruments are more about the perception of her rather than what she actually owns. And a couple other things you'll see that's very common is death gods have a lot to do with funeral rites, which makes sense. Their sacred rites would obviously be the funeral because they involve death. And then holidays like, for the Norse pagans, Veternatur, or what's more famously called Samhain or Halloween. Because around this time of year, that's when I'm filming this, and hopefully when it comes out, when those winter months are starting and things are dying around you, that also tends to be a very sacred time for death gods. At least in the European. I wasn't able to see too many holidays necessarily for other gods, but there's only so much information that I can go over, with all these different world cultures. I mean, 13 pages, there's quite a lot here. I will be doing further research down the road, just like I've done with my Odin videos and my Loki videos and my Odin Loki videos. These gods that I've already covered, there's always more information. There's always new information. I learned a lot about Hel with this, and chances are, while I'm doing research on other stuff, I'm going to learn about her more from other stuff. And I mean, everything is a process that builds upon a process, right? All the knowledge you have right now is built on what's come before. Snorri Sturluson of the younger of the two Eddas wrote this. The plate of the goddess Hel is called hunger, her servants slow and lazy. The threshold of her door stumbling block, her bed illness, and her curtains bleak misfortune. And you see within that symbolism all over the place how they perceive death. Specifically, this is probably how Snorri perceives death. And a lot of those morose, for lack of better terms, emo-goth tendencies seem to be attributed and connected to Hel. Especially within modern UPG, we definitely have seen those certain qualities imprinted upon her. Her appearance is half alive, half dead, often depicted as one half alive and then the other half dead, straight down the middle. But that's actually not certain. We don't know how she was depicted. That's how she's described, but we don't know. Like Krakenford has a video, which I'll link in the description. So does Arth Harger, where they're talking about the back half of the goddess being corpse-like or hollow. We don't know. It could be from the hips down. We don't know. I really liked the depiction of her in the game Too Human. And in that game, they explain everything through technology. So she's got like cyborg parts or whatever, but her skin is like stretched and you can see like this like muscle and inorganic parts. And that was a really interesting way to depict her as being, half corpse, half dead. Depending on the translation, the other half is either black or blue. I know Crawford translates it as blue. He's got a pretty good case for it too. But again, specificity doesn't matter so much as the symbolism. And the appearance of any deity in general will be based on that perception. I may draw Thor a little bit more, bulky and having that dad gut. Whereas somebody else, might draw Chris Hemsworth in a banana hammock. I don't know. Helheim. The underworld is also called Hell, but to distinguish it, we often call Hell the place, Helheim, meaning hell home, and it is depicted thusly, underground, right? Caves, tombs, burial mounds, within the earth. We'll see a lot of Earth Mother connections too here. The place itself has a lot of the qualities of being in the earth. It's cold, it's wet, which is opposite of how the Christians depict their underworld, which is kind of fascinating. I was also not really able to, other than like some of the judgment aspects, I really didn't see a whole lot of reasoning by why it would be fiery and hot. Again, more research required, but most underworlds tend to be cold, damp, wet. In the Mesopotamian, they drink from mud puddles, so there's obviously water there, and eat dust. And it's very important in a lot of cultures, I would say most, if not all, to give offerings to the departed, to the ancestors, so that they can have sustenance in the afterlife. That tends to be another reoccurring theme. Tomb means crossing point, from the Latin Tarentum. You're crossing over into that threshold into the underworld, right? And waters. There's always waters. In the Norse, there's a bridge. The Greek have a ferryman, charon. And our bridge brings us across the river Gjöll, which means yell. It shares an etymological similarity to like Gjallarhorn, right? Which is Heimdall's horn, and also the name of the horn that Odin drinks out of from Mimir as well. They may or may not be the same horn, but after Baldur's death, Hermodr must cross via that bridge, right? And then he comes to some gates, and there's a whole thing with the chicken and tossing it over, and there's lots of stuff, which is similar to the 5 rivers that Hades has in the Greek. According to Zenodo.org, in a 1982 article titled Waters of Memory, Waters of Forgetfulness, the Indo Europeanist pianist Bruce Lincoln reconstructed the following Proto-Indo-European, henceforth PIE, narrative from Platonic, Republic 614b to 621d, Orphic, gold tablets, Indic, Kozaitaki, Upanishad 1.4, Nordic, Gylfaginning 4.15, Grimnismal 28, Veluspa 28, and Celtic, Festi Conain Gaelic is hard. Written sources, see Table 1 in Lincoln's article for summary. Of course, this is going to be in the description. On the way to the otherworld, souls of the dead had to cross a river, the waters of which washed away all of their memories. Their memories were not destroyed, however, but were carried by the river's water to a spring, where they bubbled up and were drunk by certainly high-favored individuals, who became inspired and infused with supernatural wisdom as a result of the drink. So that may also show a connection to and he could also be surmising it because of this, but that may show a connection between Gjallarhorn, Gjol, and Odin drinking from Ymir as well. I told you I started learning more about Odin from this damn stuff. Again, it's cold, like the earth itself, like the soil. You go down deep enough. People before refrigerators created wine cellars down below. I think people still use that, but I'm not sure. I'm not a wine snob, because it was colder down beneath. You'll also find in certain like Middle Eastern palaces from back in the day before AC was a thing, a lot of them will have underground areas where they could get away from the heat. It's a very morose place. It's void of certain things rather than having certain things. There tends to be a watchdog. In the Greek, Cerberus, Hindu, Sarava, Welsh, Cunanun, Norse, Garmer, possibly associated with Fenrir. We'll actually go over all of them when I do a Fenrir video. Associated with Freki and Geri, possibly because Odin is also an underworld deity, so that could be one of the reasons that he is associated with wolves. Likely it is. And Volhol is part of the afterlife that he still has within the Norse lore, which leads us to think, and a lot of scholars agree with this, including Crawford, Valhall is located in hell, which makes sense because Elysium, the Greek Elysium, which is similar to Valhall, and Valhall deserves its own video. So much work to do in the future. But yeah, Valhall and Elysium are cognate as well. And Elysium is located in Hades. Hell's Hall is full of loved ones and information throughout the ages. It's, all of the departed are there. There's a lot of possibilities of the afterlife. So we all go to hell. It could be like a way station of sorts. Some people may stay. There's actually many different afterlives within the Norse cosmology. It's not just hell or Valhall, it's Christian perception kind of imprints that, but that's not how it works. So you have Valhall, obviously, Folkvanger, which is similar to Valhall, but Freya presides over it. The Disir, you can become Dis, you can become a protective feminine spirit and protect your loved ones. Alfar. The Alfar are also associated with the burial mound and with the departed. It's entirely plausible that the Alfar are actually revered ancestors. They may also be Fae or Jinn-like entity in their own right. I will be doing a video on that as well. A lot of research in the future. Bilskirnir. It's debated whether it's the thralls themselves or the working class that go to Bilskirnir, Thor's Hall. We see in the poem Harbarðsjóð, where Thor and what he doesn't realize is Odin are arguing. It is mentioned that Thor takes those who work, the working class. From my Thor video, I noticed that the Thunderer archetype almost always has a lot to do with the working class, with the people. And there's endless possibilities. There's also a possibility of reincarnation. You definitely have certain aspects of the self that definitely reincarnate. Your Haminja, your Fylgja, those definitely get passed on your family line. The Huger, the mind, which is our closest understanding to what we might see as a soul from the Christian perspective, that is likely what moves on. That may or may not reincarnate. There's really just no 100% defined, codified afterlife. There are possibilities, and none of them, except for Nastrand, which is where Nidhogg is, the serpent that gnaws on the roots of Yggdrasil, that might be something that is a Christian imprint. It could also be just a fact of judgment after death, which is something else, again, we see with a lot of other traditions. So, going into different cultures, the Mesopotamian. So in the Mesopotamian, we have Ereshkigal. She is the sister of Inanna Ishtar, who's a cognate of Freya. Possibly due to the dichotomy of opposites. Dichotomy of opposites is something we see a lot with these gods. We saw it a little bit with the Thunderer and the Dark Senex, like Thor and Odin. That may be one of the reasons for their argument in Harbarðsjóð. It's also seen with like Perrin and Velez. That's obviously more of a thing there. But we'll see that over and over again. She's possibly the first underworld goddess. There's also one in the Vedic that we'll go over. And I don't really know the numbers here necessarily. Definitely one of the oldest, if not the oldest, goddess of the underworld. She was placed there by the dragon of Kur. So again, without consent. That's her being taken by this dragon, who is apparently her half-brother, and brought to the underworld, where she was forced to stay. She couldn't get out, and then she became the de facto queen of the underworld. And the serpent is related to that dark senex. When we go over the serpent, we'll highlight that a bit more, but we see that connection. And it's plausible that the serpent, Jormungandr, is descended from Loki, because Loki and Odin share that same archetype, that trickster archetype. That serpent is usually associated with that trickster. And she was, one of the ones, like I said before, that was rarely talked about due to fear of invocation. People didn't want to accidentally provoke death upon themselves. Her husband is Nergal, who's a warrior god of pestilence and destruction. If you're unfamiliar with Nergal, but you're familiar with 40K, Nergal, the god of pestilence in 40K, was inspired by this god. It's actually Lovecraft that took Nergal. I can't remember if Lovecraft or if Howard did it first. The guy that wrote Conan. They were pen pals, and they exchanged a lot of information, but they both vilified Nergal and turned him into this, part of the Cthulhu mythos, kind of chthonic deity. Chthonic refers to these underworld gods. According to thecollector.com, as the Queen of Kur, Ereshkigal's role as a deity was primarily focused on death and rituals connected to the ending of someone's life. The main role of this goddess was to look after the souls of the dead and to act as a barrier between life and death, ensuring that the living and the dead did not interact. However, Ereshkigal was also tasked with guaranteeing that the dead were given proper burial rites and annual rituals. This aspect of her role was so important that she would forgo her responsibility to keep the living and the dead separate if death rituals were not being conducted properly. Most often, Ereshkigal would allow the dead to visit the living as ghosts in order to reprimand them for not conducting death rituals properly, or to remind them that the dead depended on the living for peaceful existence in the afterlife. And that's something else we see with Veternath or Samhain, Halloween. It's a time of honoring the dead and giving offerings. So the goddess of the underworld, that's her holiday. For us, as pulsified Americans, as citizens of this planet with pulse, Pulsican Americans? Pulse? I don't know, I was trying to think of something together. I swear I had something for this. To honor the departed and to give offerings. It's really something we kind of forget about in the modern day, and it's kind of sad. We're so disconnected from so much with modern consumerism and just modern culture in general. It really is. We see she's got a reluctance. She's a goddess, not a god in charge. It's that gender fluidity of that position based on the perception of that culture, right? There's a dragon associated with the underworld, which again we'll go over when we do the serpent. I did go over a little bit about the serpent in my Thor video just because they're so interconnected. Jormungandr will get his own deep dive. She's associated with owls. Owls are actually extremely prominent. I know Mesopotamia is in the Middle East, but owls are actually extremely prominent in European folklore. Interestingly enough, it's the owl, not the bat, that is associated with vampires in European lore. The vampire bat is actually native only to Oaxaca, Mexico. So I really don't know why Stoker put bats in his novel, which, made us all associate bats with vampires. They're actually associated with owls. Strix, strigoi, these are all terms for owl that are also terms for vampires and witches. I'll go over that a little bit more when I do my Ingerboda video, which is actually going to be my next god video. Obviously, funeral ceremonies, we went over that a little bit. That's another sacred rite for her. That's when it was okay to invoke or evoke death at that point. And she actually has a gatekeeper, Neti, who at least in one depiction may have had lion/bird features, but wasn't necessarily a canine. I'll deep dive into that a little bit more when I go over the Fenrir video, when I talk about hellhounds. It's a little less important for the goddess of the underworld It's just good to know that there's always a gatekeeper or something like that, and then often that gatekeeper is associated with dogs. It's likely that association with dogs and like we'll see in the Egyptian jackals is because those are who hung around graveyards because like the smell of the dead bodies, and there's a lot of carrion animals, ravens being another one, that are associated with death. Proto-Indo-European. I usually cite this guy in a lot of my videos on gods, Cesar Serith, and on his website it says, Emos and Manus. Emos, twin, Hemos, Jackson 2002, 81, and Manus, man, are another set of twins found throughout the Indo-European world. In myths from the Germanic peoples, Norse Emir and Germanic Toisto and Manus, as well as from the Celts, the Irish Dawn, and the Romans Romulus and Remus, Emos really comes into his own in the Indo-Iranian era, whereas Yama/Yima, he is the god of the land of the dead. We find them in the story of the origin of the cosmos, the primordial time. Manus sacrificed Emos and formed the world from his body, stones from his bones, the sun and moon from his eyes, water from his blood, etc. Lincoln, 1986. Manus was therefore the first priest, and Emos the first to die. Yemos, or his soul, went to the land of the dead and became its ruler. In so doing, he established the pathway to death. And here we see, again, reluctant beginning. We see that duality, and he's the god of the dead and not death itself. And we'll see some of his, like Yama in the Vedic. We'll go over him a little bit later. But there's a little bit more. So remember, the Proto-Indo-European is reconstructed based on a lot of etymology. It's not necessarily something we 100% know. So according to PyReligion.org, Devi, goddess of the earth. The native masculine italic form of the grain god is Dispater, a god associated with death, because the dead were typically buried, planted in Italy. So there's an association with the Earth Mother, because we bury our dead, taking them in, right? Cesar Serith names the Earth Mother as Degom Mater, literally Earth Mother. The modern Platonist associates Demeter with her, with the Earth Goddess. And the article's in the description if you're interested. Persephone in the Underworld as a maternal figure, a possible association with Oset, Isis, and Nephthys, who are Egyptian. Troth.org, the Troth being a large heathen organization if you're unfamiliar, on death. Death was personified by a female figure, Kolio, the Coverer, related to the Norse goddess Hel, who was seen as half living and half decaying, and who bound the dead in unbreakable bonds. Lincoln, Death, War, and Sacrifice, pp. 78-80. The dead were thought of as choosing to cross one of two different bridges, each of which led to a different afterlife. Lincoln, pp. 119, 127. Several Indo-European traditions also show the dead being ferried across a river by an aged ferryman. Lincoln, pp. 62-75. So with Kolio, who I wasn't able to find too much on, she's another reconstructed word. This is a possibility of who Hel may have been in the Proto-Indo-European era. And to give more context, the Proto-Indo-European is likely about 1,000 or so years and across multiple cultures. This isn't just one culture that we reconstructed the language for. There's a lot here. It's fairly complicated, and again, since it's a reconstruction, not always agreed upon. I also have a link below a website called Indo European Connection.com, which compares the words for death to related to morte, which is a Latin word, and morte means death. And there's a lot of different connections to that. And if you're really curious, again, link in the description. So in the Greek Hades, right? If you're unfamiliar, Hades is the god of the underworld in the Greek. Theoi.com says, Hades was the god of the underworld and the dead. He had a few shrines in the ancient world, but was honored during funeral ceremonies, and played a role in mystery cults. His only significant cult center in Greece was the Oracle of the Dead in Thesprotia. There are perhaps only two surviving cult statues of Hades, one of which is labeled a Serapis. He is depicted as a stern, bearded god, standing beside the three-headed god Kerberos. Kerberos is Cerberus, and yeah, I'm not exactly sure on the exact Greek pronunciation there. So Elysium is the Greek cognate of the Norse Valhall. There might be similarities that obviously exist in there. We'll do a Valhall video where we kind of discover to see if there's more cognates out there, because that would be pretty fascinating. Hades has a reluctance. He was placed there basically as the guy that drew the shortest straw. Poseidon got the oceans, Zeus got the skies, and Hades was left with the underworld. There's also a link, Hellenic.org, about Persephone and the seasons, in the description below, where it talks about how Persephone is abducted by Hades. Persephone may be the underworld portion of the earth goddess Demeter. She might be a derivative. We see that with archetypes where they split off based on the perception of the culture itself. Thanatos was a god for the act of dying. Charon is the journey. Hades is the masculine ruler of the underworld, and Persephone is the feminine personification. So she takes that more maternal role, the caretaker for the departed. In some of the myths, she's also the one that kind of helps out the people that go into the underworld, probably because she does take on that more maternal caretaker role that we assign to feminine people. Demeter, because of Persephone's absence, causes winter. Death is not always a loss of human life, and we'll see that with Morzana in the Slavic especially, where that death goddess is associated with the coming of winter, because it's not just the dying of us or living beings even. It can be the leaves falling from the trees. It can also be the dying of memories. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. Slavic, Morzana. So here's the goddess I was talking about that has a lot of festivals still to this day where they use her to bring about summer, because again, winter is the death of things and the cold times. I prefer winter though. I'm a winter guy mainly. MeetTheSlavs.com says, the goddess Morzana, also known as Morana in Serbian, Slovakian, and Macedonian, Marina in Russian, Mara in Ukrainian, is the Slavic goddess of winter, death, harvest, witchcraft, and nightmares. According to the myth, Morzana is the daughter of the spring goddess Lada and her husband, the god Svarog. She is recognized as the patroness of the underworld and symbolizes the end of physical life of mortals on earth. And we see some more cognate there with Demeter, for sure. Demeter being, a goddess of fertility and grain and all that stuff. She might be cognate with Lada, this spring goddess. Interesting that the daughter would be associated with the death of spring when her mother is spring. It's kind of fascinating. During the spring equinox, her effigy is drowned or burnt, depending on where she's at, to welcome summer, because the killing of that goddess represents the coming of summer, and then when winter comes around, she comes back, right? See that with the modern interpretation of the Fae in the Celtic with the Seelie and Unseelie courts, which again is a modern interpretation, but that's your summer and winter courts, how the times change. In Canaan, which if you're unfamiliar with Canaan, Canaanites were actually the precursors to the Jewish people, to the Israelites. Before Judaism, they practiced Canaanite polytheism. This is the religion they had before encountering the Zoroastrians and becoming monotheists. Mot is the god of death. He fought Baal, who's the god of storms. Again, that juxtaposition, right? Who supplanted El, god of sky. Another commonality with thunderers is then him to at least have a certain period or are the leader of the pantheon, which is one of the reasons that people think Thor may have been the leader of the Norse pantheon at some point in time. He's not unlike Velez with the conflict with Perrin, though Perrin supplanted the god of fire Svarog, not necessarily a sky god, although Svarog may be associated with the sun, and sometimes that sky father, like with Ra, who's actually all genders. Ra is not actually male, Ra is all genders. Svarog may be associated with the sun, which could also be a version of the sky father. And Odin's connection to Loki as blood brother, Loki's conflict with Thor, Odin's altercation with Thor, all of this might be cognate of that conflict between Mot and Baal. Mot personified the death of crops. Again, we saw that with Morzana just now. A seasonal death like Persephone. Same. We're seeing that theme come up. Mot personified the death of all things, even memories. In Grimnismal, Odin says, Hugin and Mugen fly every day, over all the world. I worry for Hugin that he might not return, but I worry more for Munin. They mean thought and memory. So this is Odin being afraid to lose his thought and memory. It's the death of thought and memory. Because death isn't just the death of the living, death is also the loss of things, right? There is a modern Canaanite polytheist religion called Natib Qadish. I could not find a whole lot of great sources, so forgive me for citing a Tumblr post. It was the best source I had. A lot of their religion comes from the Xcaret text, which Xcaret is a city. I believe it's in modern Syria. The Tumblr post, which is in the description if you feel like reading it, says, Xcaretians refer to the spirits of the deceased, or shades, as Rapi-Uma, Sapsu, Rapsu, or Balu. They rule the souls of the deceased. Rapsu, the chthonic deity, is associated with the planet Mars, burning plague, war, the underworld, and healing. This deity opens the gates of the underworld, allowing Sapsu to enter at night. Sapsu, the sun goddess, makes her journey to the underworld every evening. The Xcaretians may have viewed sunset as symbolic of life's end. One of Sapsu's names, Sapsu Pagri, Sapsu of the corpse, further solidifies her relationship with living and dying. Yarihu, the moon god, may journey to the realm of the deceased by day and serve as a lord in the underworld. Balu travels to the Betuhupti, House of Freedom, where he submits himself to Matu. Sapsu helps Balu return from the underworld in the ancient text. Sapsu's companion Katiruwahasui assists Sapsu nightly to slip past Ars, the sea dragon. The living may invite the Rapu Umu to feasts and drinking, gathering within the context of Marzehu, a group of people gathered to honor them, and with Lu, who often invites the Rapi Uma to share his table. We see that's kind of reminiscent of the journey of Ra. If you're familiar with Egyptian mythology, when the sun goes down at night, he goes through the underworld. The Canaanites do have some syncretism going on with the Mesopotamians, and obviously Egypt was there too. A lot of those cultures may have had syncretism, so that could just be syncretism. But that's kind of an interesting correlation as well. In the modern Jewish, they refer to the dead as shades. In Sheol, the dead that are in Sheol, their waiting place, they're shades. The dead are referred to as shades. Mot is death in Hebrew. It means death. It literally means the word death. And Sheol has a lot of similar qualities to the Norse hell. Old, desolate, kind of morose, a little darker. And I have a link to the Torah.com as well in the description if you want to read a little bit more about that, about Sheol specifically. Egypt. Osiris is the god of the underworld in Egypt, Egypt or Kemet. There's a modern neo-pagan religion called Kemeticism, Kemetic, which refers to one of the original words for Egypt, which was Kemet. Osiris is the god of the underworld. Anubis is the god of funeral rites and guardian of the departed. So there's your hound again. Duat is a process of rebirth, not unlike the Mesoamerican lore. The Kemetic Asoar is actually the name for Osiris. Osiris is actually the Greek name. There's a lot of Greek influence in our understanding of Egypt. For example, Set is actually not a bad deity. He's more cognate with Thor and the dispelling of evil and all that. Just remember, if you watch my Thor video, the Thunderer has a dangerous aspect about him, and that's one of the reasons why when the Ptolemaic Greeks come in, they make Set more of an evil typhonic figure. His wife Isis, Kemetic Set, might actually be that maternal aspect of the underworld. Her and Nephthys, who is actually the wife of Set but mother of Anubis by Osiris, might also be part of that feminine aspect of the underworld. And Isis is just kind of an all-around mother goddess. She also had a very, very prominent cult during Roman times. She's been very popular throughout that entire part of the world. It's really unfortunate that some random terrorist group took the name ISIS, and now that's just got this negative connotation. But the original name is Oset. So if you feel like making that distinction. I have 2 videos linked below that go further into depth. One channel is called the Xcaret, but their podcast is called Mythological. And they have this very long, very in-depth video on Osiris specifically. And then the Oriental Institute, which is kind of a problematic name in the modern era. But they have a really great video on the relationship of Osiris, Set, and Horus, and Isis, and all them, and that whole drama. The Oriental Institute's video, they also go over how, prior to the Ptolemaic Greeks colonizing Egypt, Set and Horus burying the conflict is actually representative of a united Egypt. In that mythological video, one of the things they mentioned is that Osiris's betrayal by Set may have actually been Greek. It's plausible that the Egyptians, because it was kind of a sacred myth, may not have actually written it down. Again, one of those beliefs in invoking something or evoking something based on creating a depiction. Osiris being cut up and resurrected is similar to Inanna and Baal. I didn't mention it, but one of the more famous interactions between Inanna and Ereshkigal is when Inanna goes into the underworld and she's cut up and resurrected. And then there's also a myth that goes into the resurrection of her husband, also having to do with the cycles, the seasonal cycles. She sacrifices her husband and then mourns, and then Ereshkigal's like, you can have him back, but only for 6 months. And then that's what like summer and winter are. And then we also see a similar thing with Baal and the Canaan, where he goes into the underworld and Mot kills him, and then he gets resurrected. I believe his sister comes in and resurrects him. So there's often that, going into the underworld thing, which is very much that like shamanic Vitki kind of journey, right? I wish we had a better word than shamanic. It kind of illustrates what I'm talking about, but one of the understandings of that shamanic initiation is the breaking down of who you are and that reconstitution, a lot of time through like spiritual journeying, which is something we still see today. I will find a better word for shaman eventually. I keep trying to think of one. The problem is that shaman is specific to a Siberian culture, and it's actually their priesthood. It would be the equivalent of like if everybody called themselves, Gothar, right? Vitki, on the other hand, is our word for like wizard, or, that wise person, Vitki or Volva, that wise person who, would be specifically Norse. Osiris now rules over the dead and represents the Duat, resurrection. He's often depicted as green, not because of being corpse-like, but rather because he is of life, of resurrection. Mesoamerica. There's a lot of syncretism in the Mesoamerican. A lot of it, despite the names and stuff, is going to seem pretty similar. If you're unfamiliar with what syncretism is, it's basically just close cultures kind of trading and exchanging different aspects of their religion and belief system and all that. Mayan. Their underworld is called Xibalba. And according to SpanishAcademyAntigua.com, in the sacred book, or the Bible of the Quiche Mayans, the name of Ixcuic is well known. This goddess is also known as Ixquic, or Mayan mother goddess of the underworld, Xibalba. She is the one who gave birth as a virgin to 2 twin gods called Hunhapu and Xbalanku. The beliefs of the Mayans about death consisted that, when they died, they only left the earthly level to go to another, and one of these levels is the Mayan underworld called Xibalba. So immediately we have a couple of similarities. We've got twins, like we saw with the Proto-Indo-European, and we have a mother goddess of the underworld, right? According to blog.xcaret.com. According to Mayan beliefs, the sacred and divine emerge from the ground and not from heaven. To die means leaving the material world only. That is why the Mayans do offerings in order to help the deceased in their spooky journey to the Xibalba. Inhabitants were usually buried in their houses or yards in comparison to the big temples and majestic graves built in honor of the aristocracy, where even women or servants were sacrificed to help the deceased on their journey. So we're seeing some similarities to how Egypt did it. Sometimes they would actually sacrifice people with their pharaohs. And then if you're familiar with Ibn Fadlan, the dude that the 13th Warrior was based off, although that movie turns into Beowulf, but the beginning is based on Ibn Fadlan. In his account, they were sacrificing servants at a king that had died. Again, not an uncommon practice. And when they said spooky journey, what they're actually referencing is Xibalba, actually means like spooky place or scary place. You'll also notice that with the Mesoamericans, they fear death, but they also venerate death because of that fear, and they also see death as part of a cycle, which is apparently one of the reasons why they weren't shy on human sacrifice, because they didn't see it as actually killing the person necessarily, but as sending them on the journey to the underworld while also appeasing the gods. Aztec god of death. And this is according to ancientorigins.net. Mictlantecuhtli was a god of the Aztec pantheon, Translated literally, his name means Lord of Mictlan, Mictlan being the Aztec underworld or land of the dead. The Aztecs believed that there were a number of paradises, and entry into them deepened on the manner of one's death. Those who failed to gain entry to these paradises, however, would end up in Mictlan, the domain of Mictlantecuhtli. And there we kind of notice he shares the name of the realm. Their underworld is very much more of a process, kind of like the Duat in Egypt. Like in Egypt, obviously you have the weighing of the heart. There's the mummification process too. But there's also a spiritual side to the mummification. In fact, their priests would put on headdresses of Anubis when they did it. The Duat was very much a cycle of rebirth, and again, that's why Osiris is green, because he represents coming back to life. The Mesoamerican gods of death tend to be a little bit more frightening, a little bit more scary, and I think that has to do, honestly, with their environment was very harsh. They lived in the rainforests, and there's a lot of shit around there that could kill you. You got jaguars popping out and shit, right? So it goes on further. According to Aztec belief, Mictlan was reserved for the souls of those who did not qualify for one of the several paradises in their belief system. Entry into these realms depended on the manner of one's death. For instance, the souls of those who died violently due to water-related causes, for instance, drowning or lightning, were destined for Tlalocan, the realm of the water god, Tlaloc. Multiple afterlives, different perspectives. I haven't really mentioned it yet. A lot of water death gods actually are similar cognate to Hell's cognates. Just kind of saving all that for when I do a Rand video, a video on like the water gods. I'm not sure if I'll give Rand one specifically or if it'll be combined with like an Aegir video. But nevertheless, like Calypso in the Greek, the Kal in her name is etymologically associated with Kel, which, if you remember, hell means hidden from the Proto-Indo-European Kel. There's association with water there. Supposedly when somebody died at sea, they would go to Ran, wife of Aegir, be captured in her net. Not unlike Davy Jones, right? From pirates. Although Davy Jones is also a synonym for Satan, because obviously 16 and 1700s pirates were mostly Christian. But you'll still see kind of a parallel there, which is kind of funny. And kind of an honorable mention, because this is also has to do with cognates. Xolotl, the underworld dog of the Aztecs, right? So we're seeing a hellhound again. And again, ancientorigins.net. Xolotl was a deity normally associated with Quetzalcoatl, one of the most important gods in the Aztec pantheon. As a matter of fact, Xolotl was regarded to be the twin of Quetzalcoatl. Unlike his twin, however, Xolotl is traditionally given negative attributes, which is evident in his physical form as well as how he is symbolized elsewhere. So, we're seeing a twin motif there. Quetzalcoatl, by the way, is the winged serpent. We'll go more into him again in the Jormungandr video. Apparently, Xolotl also chases the sun, so we see that as a similar. With the Fenrir, Skoll chases the sun, and Skoll is one of Fenrir's children, and Hati chases the moon. Now, Mictlantecuhtli actually has a wife, which is definitely more in the realm of Hell's cognate, as opposed to that masculine underworld deity. So her name is Mictecihuatl, the Aztec goddess of the dead, and this is from Mango Publishing Group. In one version of the myth, Mictecihuatl and Mictlantecuhtli are thought to have a role collecting the bones of the dead so that they could be gathered by other gods and returned to the land of the living, where they would be restored to allow the creation of new races. The fact that many races exist is because of the bones were dropped and mixed together before they made their way back to the land of the living for use by the gods of creation. I think they're kind of misusing the word race, because mostly when I was researching, I would hear different like sizes and shapes of people, not necessarily race. Because race is actually more of a modern concept, which came about around like the 1600s, so it's highly unlikely that this culture would have that. But differences in people were supposedly be because when Quetzalcoatl created mankind, which was like not the first age of man, by the way, he took the bones from Mictlantecuhtli, and due to Mictlantecuhtli's shenanigans, the bones were dropped, and thus people are different sizes. But back to Mictecihuatl. She's associated with festivals of Day of the Dead, which is still practiced in Central America, in Mexico at least. I'm not sure about South America, but definitely, obviously, Mexico. And this is something else that's pretty interesting. To this day, death gods, although personified as saints, are extremely important to Mesoamericans, to Mexico and South America. We have Santa Muerte in the north, and then Señor la Muerte in the south. And these death cults are kind of quasi-Catholic, not recognized by the Catholic Church, but nevertheless, they're extremely important. And something else that's very interesting is people that feel like they're on the outskirts of society will gravitate toward these death gods. To this day, these death personifications are extremely important. LGBTQ people down there feel like they may not be able to go to the Christian God or these other saints, but they can go to Santa Muerte, pray and ask for favors and do all the religious stuff. Interestingly enough, the cartels also are very big on Señor la Muerte and Santa Muerte. There's a huge following in their prison systems. It's these people that are on the outskirts of society that feel like they can go to these death gods. Well, they would call them saints, but a saint by any other name in any other culture would be a god. But we see with Xibalba and Mictlan, they both have steps to reincarnation. In some instances, Mictlan was actually 9 levels with various different processes. The first level of which was dogs. It was hounds again. So there's your hellhounds, which is really, really interesting. And lastly, we'll go over the Inca. And this is from messagetoeagle.com. Ukupacha, Underworld, was not considered as an entirely negative concept. In his Handbook of Inca Mythology, Paul Steele says that Ukupacha was linked to the feminine Earth Mother and the bones of the ancestors, and the place's subterranean water was regarded by Incas as life-sustaining springs which link the human realm to the inner world. Immediately we're seeing similarities. We're seeing Earth Mother. Obviously water's a huge thing. Subterranean. All of these themes that just come up all over the world, right? Ukupacha also is very similar to the name of the Mayan god of death, whose name I can't remember, but I'll put it up on the screen. I know Pacha isn't part of it, so we're seeing more syncretism there with the Incas as well. Asia. So starting with Japan and Shinto, we have Izanami. She's a goddess of death. Again, we see dualism with an opposing force. Her husband is Izanagi. They were both creator deities, said to have created the world and all the other gods, and she actually died during childbirth. It ends up going to the underworld. So we've got that reluctance, we've got that death again. She has a corpse-like visage. Obviously that looking like you are dead is definitely a theme we see with death gods. So according to yamatomagazine.home.blog, I try to find direct sources. I try to find either sources from experts, people that worship, or preferably a combination thereof. I can't always find that, so but at the same time, I want sources that you'd be able to click on and look through and study on your own, because knowledge is a process. It's a journey. It's never like a destination, really. We're always building on what we had before. yamatomagazine.home.blog. A journey into the underworld. Izanami and Izanagi were responsible for creating many Japanese gods, with one of the most recognizable being the fire deity Kagutsuchi. Izanami died giving birth to Kagutsuchi, sending Izanagi into a rage that caused him to kill his son. Unable to live without his wife, Izanagi ventured into Yomi to rescue her. When he found her, Izanami informed him that she was unable to leave the underworld because she'd already eaten the food and was bound to the land of the dead. Izanami pleaded with the other gods to set her free and asked her husband to be patient. However, Izanagi refused to wait. When Izanami was sleeping, he took the comb that kept her hair together and set it alight so he could see her face. But Izanami's beauty had been replaced by a rotting corpse, with maggots crawling through her decomposing flesh. So there's a pretty sight. And it almost reminds me a little bit of Orpheus going into the underworld, not being able to retrieve his love. So I kind of wonder if maybe there's an older story that's super old that may have inspired that. And we see themes. Here's a mother goddess. Here's somebody who ate the food and has to stay. Interestingly enough, that is something we see in other mythologies, like the Fae. If you get captured by the Fae, you're told not to eat the food there because then you have to stay. And that's obviously in the Celtic. The food eating is also depicted in the anime Spirited Away. If you haven't seen it, the protagonist's parents end up eating all this food. It turns out to be the spirit's food. They get trapped there and get turned into pigs, and then of course she has to go on this long journey to rescue them. By the way, if you aren't into anime, and I'm really not, to be honest, I was when I was younger, but they get so convoluted. But the Studio Ghibli movies are actually really good, and there's a lot of Japanese spirituality that's in there. If you're slightly familiar with, you'll be able to recognize. It's really fascinating. That brings us to the Ainu. If you're unfamiliar, the Ainu are actually the indigenous people of Japan before the Japanese people that we think of as Japanese today colonized. It's kind of sad. It's similar to the Sami, how the Sami are these indigenous people that kind of get the short end of the stick and don't get a whole lot of representation despite actually influencing the dominant culture. You're going to see that in this. I'll point some things out. Their gods were known as Kamui, which is similar etymologically to the Shinto Kami. Right? So we can already see that they've influenced what Japan considers its native religion. And they were polytheistic animists, which, the majority of the world was polytheistic animists at one point in time. According to the website Toda on the Ainu's beliefs, unlike most other creatures, humans possess unique souls. They retain their identities in the afterlife, existing eternally in spirit villages. This special relationship with the gods comes at a price. In exchange for gifts of food, shelter, and good health, the Kamui demand respectful treatment and worship. Those who do not observe proper etiquette toward the gods can be punished with famine and misfortune. As a result, most Ainu worship focuses on giving thanks and gifts and the gods and spirits in them. So we're already seeing some similarities to Shinto. If you're unfamiliar, they have cleansing rituals that they have to do before they go into temples. There's actually an issue with an underclass that exists because of some professions that were considered dirty and you could not cleanse. That's a bit of a problem. I'm not really a fan of enforcing cleansing rituals myself. I don't really do it in Norse paganism. It kind of goes along with that whole, all beliefs are valid as long as they don't cause harm. Like morticians, for example, that would be considered a dirty job where you would have to do cleansing rituals so much that it's nearly impossible, because every time you touched a dead body, you'd have to do that cleansing ritual. And then unfortunately, people like that got ostracized, and so did their descendants. Without ostracizing entire groups of people, cleansing rituals are fine. And we also see cleansing rituals in traditions like Judaism and Kemet. And I know that in Kemet, the Egyptian, if you look at some of their ancient art, you'll see that, like, monks, priests with shaved heads, like completely shaved heads. They would actually go through like a cleansing ritual where they would shave all the hair off their body, as well as bathe before entering temples and stuff like that, which may have been something that the archheathens did, but we have no evidence of it. I do know of some heathens, some modern heathens, that do incorporate at least some kind of small cleansing ritual, and it's possible that the cleansing ritual that Ibn Fadlan had seen in his encounter with the Kievan Rus may have also been a cleansing ritual, but really we don't know because we only have his perspective of it and no other evidence. And another similarity, offerings. We're seeing offerings all over the place. Offerings to the ancestors. That is huge in so many of these cultures. We just see it keep coming up. So it continues. Many Kamui appear in Ainu worship and folklore, reflecting their presence in every part of daily life. Some, however, were more frequently worshipped than others. Most important of all was Kamui Fuchi, the hearth goddess, who lived within the central fireplace of every Ainu home. Besides warming and protecting the home, her fire acted as a gate to and from the spirit world. She pulled new souls from the fire during birth and escorted the dead to the afterlife. In ancient times, she taught the first Ainu all of the arts they needed to survive. So that's pretty fascinating. So their central goddess, their hearth goddess, that mother goddess, seems to take on that position as goddess of the underworld. She's a hearth goddess, which is similar to the Irish Brigid or the Greek Hestia. Frigg may also be a hearth goddess. I haven't seen too much direct evidence on Frigg being a hearth goddess, but honestly, I don't really focus too much on Frigg, so I really haven't studied her. Again, eventually I'll do a video. There's so many videos I need to do. As a hearth goddess, she's linked to that sacred mother role, and there's an added psychopomp aspect. Again, that psychopomp is the guide of the dead. According to Baldir's blog, another goddess, Irura, this goddess was the psychopomp of the Ainu pantheon. She and her dog would guide a dead spirit from their grave post in this world to whichever afterlife the fire goddess Fuchi had decreed the soul would be sent to, either for reward or punishment. Souls being punished were not subjected to hellfire, like in the Western traditions, but were instead condemned to a realm of constant icy cold rains. We're seeing an afterlife that's cold and wet, as opposed to fiery. Not a whole lot of fiery afterlives. The Christians, they're really just kind of the special snowflake of religions. If you look at the rest of the world, it's really funny. Though we're seeing a dog again. We're seeing that dog involved in the afterlife. It's possible that dogs aren't just associated because of the carrying on animal thing, but also because we use dogs to guard and to guide and to hunt. And dogs have been integral in human civilization and progressing as a species. That's one of the reasons why the wolf is so prominent in symbolism all over the world. Something that's really sad about Japan is that because of Western practices, they actually killed off all the wolves in their country. The Edo wolf is dead. They're extinct. They have been resigned to cryptozoological sightings. It's really unfortunate because the Ainu had actually considered the wolf as a god. Studio Ghibli, again, if you watch the movie Princess Mononoke, the tribe of the male protagonist in that, they're Ainu. Those are an Ainu people. They're one of the tribes. There's obviously multiple tribes, just like indigenous people all over the world. The wolves in that are considered gods. All of the animals have certain gods, right? And they're kind of dying out as modern society is encroaching in and iron is poisoning them and stuff. That is a fairly decent, from my understanding, because obviously I'm not an expert on the Ainu. From my understanding, that's a fairly decent representation. Again, highly recommend Studio Ghibli movies. Amazing when it comes to like Japanese spirituality, just very fascinating. Moving on to India, something else I've noticed with India specifically is they seem to really heavily influence mainland China, so I didn't really hit on China in this. Future videos I probably will. I digress. So according to India Times, Yama, the god of death, was the son of Surya, the sun god, and Saranya. He is the twin brother of Yami, who became the river Yamuna. He was the first mortal to die, and so was made the god of death. His noose is always following everybody, and it is the distance between the noose and people that decides their life. Yama, along with the accountant Chitragupta, keeps count of everybody's deeds. If a person performs good deeds, he goes to heaven, bad deeds, hell, and if both, then back to earth for another life. Obviously in Hinduism, reincarnation and that reincarnation cycle is pretty big, and that obviously transferred over to Buddhism. Clearly this is one of the sources for the Proto-Indo-European myth that we went over earlier. The noose thing I found to be pretty interesting. One of the gods we'll go over later, Oya, her husband Shango hung himself and then ascended to godhood. And then we see Odin also hung himself and sacrificed himself to himself. And I'm wondering if the noose, specifically the rope, has some kind of far older association. We saw that a little bit mentioned with Koloyo. Again, she's a reconstruction, so it's a little hard to suss out, but that rope may have been an early implement prior to modern depictions of death, where he uses a scythe, or Thanatos, he uses a sword, and obviously like Odin has a spear. But yeah, maybe the rope was the first tool of the death god. So I prefer to look at the Vedic period because it's an older period. You get closer to that source material. According to Mahavidya.com, on the Vedic era, despite Yama's later evil role in Hindu mythology, the Vedas describe Yama as the first man who died and the king of the departed. Vedic tradition also references Yama as the Lord of Justice, giving him the title Dharma. Yama can be interpreted to mean twin. In Vedic tradition, some myths have him paired up with his twin sister Yami. Surya, the sun god, also the father to Yama, his brother Shani, and his sister Yami. Yami has a minor role in the Rig Veda, but fascinatingly, Shani is portrayed as the deity that gives the sentence of one's deeds throughout life by appropriate punishment and reward. Yama grants the outcome of the actions after death. And I'm wondering if their harsher afterlife might have a Western influence, as obviously famously the West, England specifically, colonized India. I don't know timelines, but I have to look into it deeper. But I kind of wonder, because we do see judgment in afterlives. It's never the point where the Christian hell is. There's even Buddhist representations of their hells, their afterlives, where you burn off your karma and then you get resurrected. It really depends on the branch of Buddhism, because there's more than one type of Buddhism. Nothing that's the fire and brimstone of Christianity. So it goes on regarding the Buddhist perception of Yama. In addition to Hindu mythology, Yama is included in Buddhist teachings. Though in Buddhism, Yama loses his role as judge and punisher of the underworld because Buddhist teachings state that karma alone will determine an individual's fate come time for death. Logically, because of karma, there is no need for a supernatural justice, restating the lack of Yama's role. Come death, the souls of the dead are reminded by Yama the concept of karma, and that the souls are responsible for the punishment they will undergo. Buddhist teachings also surround Yama by a concept of Mara, which speculates Yama is hidden in the embodiment of moral evil. Contrasting him from the Hindus' depiction of Yama, dark-screened skin, gruesome face, and copper eyes, and blood-red robes, Tantric Buddhism shows Yama as a terrifying figure ornamented with human skulls, consumed by flames, and holding in his right hand Pranja, sword of insight, and in his left hand the mirror of karma. So the individual looking into the mirror shows the true reflection of their deeds. Japanese Buddhism worships Emma, same role as Yama, the demon lord of the underworld who judges the dead. Emma, Yama, can also be overruled by prayers. It's an interesting perception. Definitely a lot more judgment in the afterlife over in India. Going over a Vedic goddess of death, according to vedicgoddess.weekly.com, in the Mahabharata, Brahma's children multiplied, but did not die. Soon the cosmos was overflowing with jivas, which alarmed Brahma. So, Mrityu's creation was justified. When informed of her duty, Mrityu ran away. Birth. Mahabharata, Book 12, Chapter 249, verses 15 and 16. After the self-born had withdrawn and suppressed that fire, there came out from all of the outlets of his body a lady attired in robes of black and red, with black eyes, black palms, wearing a pair of excellent earrings, and adorned with celestial ornaments. The goddess of death was reluctant to kill infants, youths, and aged ones who have done her no injury. Again, reluctance, right? We're seeing her not really wanting that role. The goddess of death is more of a caring figure. And later, after a lot of reluctance, it goes on to say, Mrityu relented only when told that those she would kill would be reborn. When you strike, there will be desire and anger in the heart of the dying man that will ensure his rebirth, said Brahma. She would kill only the material and hence mortal component of Jiva. Mrityu being elevated as goddess, then Brahma goes to create Saraswati, his daughter, who is also pursued for lust. She takes asylum in Kailash. Mrityu, goddess of death, was said to be unhappy from the moment she was born, from the scowl of high god Brahma. She was assigned the test of destroying life. She wept until her eyes were red as sari, but Brahma convinced her that because human would fear her, they would be captured once again for the wheel of desire, ensuring that they would be reborn. Mritu grew into her job, becoming a goddess who killed children in the womb and grooms on their wedding nights. She lived in cremation grounds outside of the village, where food was offered her in hopes that she would stay on the periphery and not wander into the village homes. So we're seeing extreme reluctance. Cares for the departed. She's duty bound. Duty bound seems to be another big thing. They're bound to fulfill that role. Corpse-like visage, very scary looking, obviously. And eventually she's replaced by a male god. It seems like a lot of cultures slowly became more patriarchal. We'll talk about that a little bit more when I go over that Ingerboda video. We'll also go over the matrone a little bit, which is probably the inspiration for the Wiccan threefold goddess, although they kind of get it wildly wrong. Isn't the way they perceive it. That was kind of a creation of Gerald Gardner and later Wiccans. And again, we'll go over all that when I go over Ingerboda and kind of how patriarchal forces changed a lot of stuff. Something with Ereshkigal and Inanna is, as they kept having male kings, the goddesses, even though they were super powerful, kind of fell by the wayside, which could be one of the reasons why we have less information in our arch-heathen lore about the goddesses than we do about the gods, which is kind of sad because, obviously we should venerate both, right? Yoruba. The Yoruba are the largest ethnic group in Africa. I talked about Shango in my Thor video, so I thought they would be a good example. Also, it was just really hard to find any other really fleshed out lore about other death gods in Africa, other than Egypt, obviously. Egypt has tons of lore. The other people groups in Africa, which is a big-ass continent, I really couldn't find a whole lot. But we do have information on the Yoruba. This Nigerian website, pulse.ng, on Oya, the goddess of death. Oya is also associated with funerals. Part of her duty is to carry the souls of the dead to the afterlife. She helps people who die transition into the afterlife and carries the souls of the dead to their final resting place. She is the guardian of the graveyard, the goddess in charge of cemeteries. Cemeteries are important in traditional religion for people seeking favors from her. Because of this, she is called the Great Mother of Witches or the Elders of the Night. Oya has psychic abilities. She could perceive things beyond the world and call forth the dead for discussions. She can even hold them back if she feels they have unfinished business on Earth. Once angered, she can destroy villages and communities with floods and any other natural disasters she deems fit. She is fierce because she hates lies and injustice and would not refrain from pouring her wrath on those who dare her. So this is obviously one of the more fierce death goddesses, and she also seems like the ultimate necromancer, which I think is kind of cool. A lot of her attributes are things that people might attribute to hell via UPG, in association with witches, as well as actual necromantic practice. Traditional necromancy isn't raising the dead and having them be your slaves like in a lot of fantasy stuff. Necromancy is literally just working with the dead. Necromancy, death, magic. Divining things using spirits, that's necromancy. And it was not originally connotated as something that is evil. That's something that later happened, probably due to Christians. They think everything is Satan. I pick on the Christians a lot, but it's just so easy. She's a goddess of weather as well as a psychopomp. Usually thunderers have rain or earth wives. She's technically both, but not quite either, which is pretty fascinating. She's a mother goddess, so we're seeing that again, who cares for the dead. And based on a lot of these cognates, we can extrapolate that Hel is also a mother goddess, but not in the sense that she gives birth, more so like a foster mother or a caring aunt, somebody that would take people in even though they're not her biological children. That's the kind of maternal mother figure that Hel is. We're seeing that in these other goddesses, right? She's a goddess of change, cutting down the old to make room for the new. We saw that with Mritu. And that's really something that death itself does, right? Cycles of change, winter, all these cyclical things that need to happen in order for life to go on. If everybody was immortal, that might ease a lot of pain in the world, but but then it become overpopulated. Sometimes, and this is kind of morbid, but this is something I've noticed, people that live a long time can become very embittered. So maybe that cycle of death and rebirth is a way to refresh that person's hugger, that person's mind, that person's internal soul, right? Whatever you want to call it. And that's more speculation on my part, but that's something really I've always kind of thought. You know, death is almost necessary in order to cleanse and change, and we're seeing that with Oya. Shango was her husband, who hung himself, leading to apotheosis. I went over that in my Thor video. I talked about it a little bit earlier, which is, again, of course, possibly connected to Odin's sacrifice. So other than that source, I found a really good New York Times interview with Jacob Kahinde Olupona, a professor of African religious traditions at the Harvard Divinity School, on the Owo Yoruba afterlife. It is assumed that death doesn't end a person's life, but instead marks a passage from one realm of existence to the next. Hence the Yoruba believe there is an afterlife, or an after death, in which the living dead exist as part of the sacred cosmos. There is also an ambiguous response to death. Depending on the circumstances surrounding the event, death in very old age, for example, is welcomed as fulfillment of one of the cardinal life quests. This form of death is celebrated by the community as a necessary transition to the ancestral world. On the other hand, deaths that occur in infancy, childhood, or young adulthood are frowned upon and not often celebrated because the deceased was yet to accomplish their, he says his or her, I'm saying there. Just say they. It's one syllable. Sorry, it's an older guy. Back on track. Death involving unnatural causes fall into the same category. It is by tradition a taboo for older people to participate in young people's funerals, to ward off the malicious knell of death. This is also because of a younger person is considered bad death, not worth celebrating by the elderly. It is a taboo for kings, Oba, to witness funeral celebrations or behold a dead body. So there's some interesting perceptions of death, which I think a lot of people share. And they also have a healthier understanding of older people passing. Elders becoming the sacred departed, if you will. The ancestors that we venerate during times like, Veternatar and Alpha Blot, or for the heathens, obviously. So going into the Gaelic Irish, I'm going to do a larger video on the Morrigan because I didn't realize how interesting really she is. She's definitely an example of how archetypes can exist within one pantheon and be split as well as a whole. And she shares a lot of cognate with not only Odin, but the Valkyrie, a little bit with Hel, which is why I'm showing her here. I mean, she's just a really, really fascinating goddess. She's a goddess of death, war, fate, and crows. The crows obviously being a carrion bird, just like Odin's ravens, both of which are corvids, which are highly intelligent beings, which can also be an attribute of Odin or the Morrigan. And the fate thing is also interesting because she's considered a triple goddess, which is kind of that descending from that matrone, which is, like I mentioned earlier. It's possible that there's an older, more matriarchy-focused religious practice that's European, at least, with these three goddesses. It's not the maiden mother crone thing like the Wiccans do. We see that similarity in the Nornir as well as the Greek fates, and there's a lot of that three goddess motif. Brigid also kind of has that with the three sisters kind of thing. She's the guardian of the dead, but not necessarily a reaper. Some of the goddesses that make her up. So sometimes the Morrigan is one, sometimes she's multiple, right? The Bav, Maka, and Naemon are the three main, and then sometimes Fea and Anu. So as Bav, battle goddess, Crow, chooser of the slain, Maka, sovereignty, independence of warrior women, retribution, Nemain, battle frenzy akin to Berserker Gungar, inspired by Odin's Other. Fea, similar to Bav, could be the same goddess. Anu, sovereignty of the land, possibly an earth mother, maybe Danu herself. Danu is the Tuatha and the main family of gods in Irish mythology. That's their namesake. that might be another representation of that earth goddess. And despite the Morrigan's popularity, I didn't find a whole lot of websites that I truly trusted as a source. I really wanted to cite the Irish Pagan School. They have a great YouTube channel, by the way. Highly recommend it. But you have to pay for a lot of their classes and I didn't want to quote something that somebody watching this video might want to click on. I want sources that are easily accessible and don't have a paywall or any of that. If you are interested in Irish paganism at all, they're a great source. I've been watching their videos and they're pretty decent. But this source is teaandrosemary.com. The Morrigan is a multiplicitous deity of Celtic lore, a goddess of death, war, prophecy, and fate. The Morrigan was the deity who would ultimately decide whether or not a warrior would survive the battlefield. Her appearance is often heralded by a murderer or cawing of crows. At times, it is the wake of death, her crows pecking away at the bodies of the fallen. Understandably so, the Morrigan is one of the most feared, yet misunderstood goddesses in Celtic mythology. Her Irish name is Mór Urugai, which can be translated to Phantom Queen. If that's not the most badass sounding epithet for a goddess you've ever heard, then I want to know what pantheons you're researching that I've been missing out on. So you'll notice the sisters that make up the Morrigan, a lot of them overlap. They have very similar spheres of influence. Gods are never necessarily a god of one thing specifically, not usually anyway. It's more of a sphere of influence. One of the things we see with archetypes, there's a lot of blurred lines, you know? And interestingly enough, she's a warrior goddess who never really engages in battle. She's more of a tactician and influencer, which is pretty fascinating. She's more of a string puller, a general who kind of moves the chess pieces, which is a really fascinating goddess. I'm going to dedicate more of a video to her and talk about her cognates in the Norse pantheon at some point. I know I'm planning on doing a lot of videos. Stick with me, eventually they'll come out. Might be a decade from now, but we'll have a lot of videos. I have over 100 on this channel now, and there's still so many more that I want to make. And finally, summary. So it's important to say that archetypes are the bones, gods are the personalities. And sometimes bones are shared, bones are taken away, and another personality is put on them, to keep using that analogy. Because these gods do have individual personalities, you'll notice that there's a lot of difference here, even though they share cognates, right? They're not the same god, they're not the same goddess, they're not the same deity, they are their own, but at the same time they share that archetypal origin, and with that we can extrapolate some differences and similarities. No two death gods are one for one identical. We can extrapolate similarities to discern the original archetype, and then that will give us, especially with deities where there's not a whole lot of information, like in my Ostara Bloat video, we were able to extrapolate a lot of the dawn goddess aspects that we didn't realize. So she's probably one of those parts of Sol, the sun goddess. Using this method of the video that you're watching right now and the other god videos I've done, we can find information, or at least possible information, that we would not be able to find because the direct source just doesn't exist. Hidden goddess. Death is certain, but the time and place is unknown. Also a euphemism for the grave, because the grave itself is hidden, right? So not only is hell covered, she's hidden, like the tomb, like the burial mound, like the grave. Her realm is the same. Death is something that is uncertain and unseen, and so is she. The underworld is the grave and may have a spiritual realm parallel, but it is the grave. Caves, tombs, etc. We see in the lore, people will go into tombs and they might speak to their ancestors or whatever. So they're still there because the tomb, the grave, the burial mound is part of hell's realm. There may be a spiritual parallel to that, where there's an actual underworld of some sort, but also those graves are part of that realm. And we do have a lot of evidence of Norse burial mounds. The Viking funeral idea of the burnt up ship, I haven't really seen that a whole lot. I'm going to do another video on funeral rites. I'm going to do also marriage. There's going to be a couple of videos on that. I just want to do a deep dive to really understand it before I put that out. Justice. Justice is another factor we kept seeing, right? Death is the great equalizer. Hamingia is essentially our spiritual judgment. A good Hamingia is good reputation. We are our deeds, right? First and foremost, we are our deeds. The actions you take in the situations that arise within your life show the quality of your character. And Hamingia is your luck. That is something that will precede you and help your family. We do have something called Orla. It looks like it's spelled Orlog, it's Orla. That is also fate, which is also very similar to karma and might fit that justice kind of quality. And then, of course, there's Nostron, which, if you look at all these other religions having that judgmental aspect, though rare, it's entirely possible that that isn't a Christian interpretation, or at the very least, maybe Christians influenced Nostron, but maybe it was something that did exist prior. Nidhogg, the dragon who resides there, who gnaws on people, is really the personification of entropy, the slow destruction of all things around us, which is why Nidhogg is one of the only beings to survive Ragnarok, because Nidhogg is entropy itself, is the decay of all things, which is a constant and cannot be killed because it's an abstract. Your Hugr is what is likely to pass on. That's your mind. I've done a video on that. It's probably what passes on into whatever afterlife, and so forth and so on. Fylgja also passes down the family line. Your Fylgja is your spirit animal, your spirit guide. And again, I have another video on that, including how to find your Fylgja, which is in that video. Then another part of yourself, your Hammer, which is your skin, your shape, is the form of you, it's your body. That rots in the dirt. That is the thing that the earth takes back. Fertilizer, the worm food that creates new life. Which is another really important part of death that people don't really realize, because it is a cycle, right? We see cycles a lot in the research I did. When things die, things are also born, right? Plants survive on a lot of dead matter because that puts nutrients in the ground. Death can create life, and it's a whole cycle. Just like the Lion King taught us, right? And hell isn't death the act. Hell is the caretaker of the dead. She's not a Grim Reaper. Some people will kind of attribute that. She's not a Grim Reaper. We do have other figures that do similar things, but Hel herself is not a reaper. She's a caretaker of the dead. She's the grave mother, the goddess of the upturned dirt. She's the one that cares for our loved ones after they pass. She would also be associated with funeral rites. That was something that also came up constantly. So when we do funeral rites for our kith and kin who are heathen and would like that kind of rite after their passing, Hel is definitely one to invoke and evoke during that rite. Ultimately, she is the personification for wanting our loved ones cared for. That's a big theme with Hel. She is the embodiment of what we want for our loved ones in the future. That's why Hel is not a fiery place full of death and the gnashing of teeth, lawyers taking pitchforks up the butt. It's a very somber, morose place like the grave, but it's peaceful. It's very quiet. There's not a whole lot of conflict. A lot of heathens who've been doing it for a minute wouldn't mind going to Hel because it's not a bad place. Hel is pretty chill. Personally, I wouldn't mind Valhalla, but it's only because it seems like a badass video game, and if I could get hurt and not have to worry about it, wouldn't that be awesome? I don't know. That's just me, maybe. So if you have anything to add, feel free to comment. If I got anything wrong, feel free to comment. Knowledge is a journey. It is not a destination. If I don't know something, I will say I don't know it, and please correct me. I know I can be kind of a dick when it comes to being corrected. Even though I push back a little bit, that doesn't mean I'm not thinking about the words that you said. Because I do. That honestly occurs more on the subreddit r/Norse paganism than it does in my YouTube. The acquisition of knowledge doesn't occur without conflict, without a conflict of the mind, without bashing our words together and seeing what fruit plummets, to use a really weird analogy that just came to my mind, but I like it because the visual. Skull.